All right, well, welcome to today's new board member webinar. I am Jennifer Smith. I'm Director of Government Relations at the Michigan Association of School Boards. And with me today is Kent Cartwright, our Deputy Director, and Jeff Cobb, our Assistant Director of Government Relations. And we're going to talk to you a bit about school finance. This is going to be an overview, not the nitty gritty. So feel free to ask any questions you may have. Put them in the chat if you could, and we'll answer them as we go through. And we're going to start with Kent talking about it at the district level, and then we'll shift to Jeff and I to talk about it from the broader state level. Now we'll turn it over to you, Kent.
All right. Well, again, welcome to this session this afternoon, and we are going to dazzle you with an outstanding presentation starting at the district level, and then we're going to move into how the state level information affects you at the district level. So Jen, if you want to, there we go. So let's talk about, one of the biggest things that a school board works on during the year. It may not be the most fun, but it is one of the more important things, and that is your budget. And the thing about a budget to remember is that it's much more than simply a checkbook where you figure out what money is coming in and what money is coming out. Done correctly, a budget really reflects your district's priorities and you as a Board of Education, your priorities. Next slide, please. It is a living document. This is a document that I'm going to show you a calendar here in a minute, and you're going to see that we actually start putting that together in the midwinter or early winter. But from that point forward, we continually come back to that document and update it as we get better information and as things change. And especially if you look back here the last 18 to 24 months, things have changed a lot for you. And your budget has probably been updated to reflect that as we go along. As I mentioned earlier, this budget really should be a reflection of your priorities. What is important to you and to your district in the area of financial needs. If we do this correctly, you develop those priorities, and once those are developed, then you work on your budget, and the budget should reflect that. And the last thing is we can't forget that, school boards are a political body out there, and your budget is a way to communicate to your constituents the resources that have been made available to your district and how you as a school board have chosen to allocate them. So it's a great method of communication. Next slide, please. So your vision as a school board and your vision as a district should be reflected in the budget. And what this does is show your community, yes, we're listening to you. Our vision and goals and direction reflects the community's focus, and our budget follows right along with it. Next slide, please. So this is a typical budget calendar for one budget. And now understand, you can see that this budget starts in January, and it actually, in this slide, it actually goes through almost 18 months. It goes into June of the following year. And so if you think about this, there is a period of time starting from January through June of every year that your business office and your CFO and your superintendent and yourselves, you're actually juggling two budgets. You're juggling the school year that you're in, and you are also working on the school year that's coming up. So let's talk about here in January, if we were to put a year on it, we could say January of 2021. At this point, you're going to be talking about the Revenue Consensus Conference that goes on at the state level. And while you may not have a lot of influence at the state level, you certainly, your budgets are certainly impacted by what comes out of there. And that January Revenue Consensus Conference gives us a first blush at the level of funding that we may be able to begin to develop our budgets on. So moving forward in the spring break timeframe, March to April, your district business offices and your superintendent are, and your administrators actually, they are working to develop what are called your budget assumptions. And I say budget assumptions because during this time of the budget process, we really don't have much hard information that we can work with that's going to affect the budget year coming up starting July 1st. All we can do is make good estimates, good assumptions. And so that's what you should be working on at that point, particularly in the area of staffing. What do you think your staffing is going to look like for the upcoming September? And what do you think your pupil count is going to look like? Once you've developed those assumptions and you continue to gather information, we get into the May and June timeframe. School year is, the current school year is ending, but you as a school board and your administrative team is actually finalizing the budget for the upcoming year, and you are holding budget hearings. And the one hard date that you've got to hit is June 30. June 30 is the mandatory budget adoption date. This can be a little frustrating because you're going to see here that, you know, a large chunk of your revenue is dependent upon the state of Michigan, and yet their hard date for adopting their budget that affects your upcoming school year is actually October 1 or September 30. So there are years where you're adopting a budget and you are not going to actually know for sure the final level of state funding. So you adopt the budget in June 30, and then what happens over the summer is we wait and we gather information as the state finalizes their budget, as we do pupil counts. And so the September and October timeframe is a period where we begin to see assumptions turn into knowns. And as that occurs, depending on how big those changes are, you may find your administrative team coming to you with revisions. Another good date is early November. That's your audit report is due, and you will receive at one of your board meetings that report probably from your auditors, and it tells you how well the year that just finished in June 30 financially came out. So we go through that, and we get into January and February again of the following year, of that school year, and you probably see yourself doing budget revisions. And then in most school districts, as you roll into June, you do a final budget revision just in time to get ready for the auditors.
Ken, we had a question about revisions. How significant revisions are we talking about? Can you maybe talk about what that means in terms of making revisions?
Yeah, the revisions are as significant or as insignificant as the difference between your assumptions and what becomes reality. So to give you an example, if you make an assumption that you're going to have flat enrollment, so you're not going to gain any students and not going to lose any students, and your actual September count, for instance, comes in where you lost 2 students, that's not a significant change. And you may not even do a revision for that one item. But if you assume that you're going to have flat and you lost 25 students, that may be very significant for your district, and you may then have to say, oh man, we've got to revise that budget. Or it could go the other way. You could gain 25 kids and suddenly realize that maybe you could add an extra section of something that you had hoped to do when you were building your budget, but had decided not to, because you didn't think you could afford it. So it really, budget revision size or the magnitude of that is really a function of how accurate your assumptions are. So I saw a question there, if it was significant enough to revise. Let me see here. I think the question was, if it's significant enough to revise, when should you do the revision? Is that accurate? Yeah. Okay, so if it's significant enough to revise, that should come to board. Yes, all budget revisions have to be approved by the Board of Education to become official. And you should probably see that budget revision. You're going to see at least 1 and probably 2 in a year And you may see more than that depending on how many changes occur. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to start talking about school funding sources at the district level. That's our next topic. We're going to dive down into the details here. Next slide, please. So let's talk about state funding first. There's four main pots, but we're going to talk about state funding because it simply makes up 77% of your overall revenue in your school district. Now that 77% is broken up into two chunks, and the first one and the biggest one is the foundation allowance. And the foundation allowance there's a long history behind it that's beyond the scope of this presentation. But it is essentially designed to provide a guaranteed minimum amount of funding per district, per student. The foundation allowance does vary from district to district. Approximately 60% of the districts are at what's called the base foundation, and the rest have somewhat different amounts that are higher for reasons that are historical in nature. And then the second group of funds are the categorical grants, and these are grants that are focused on specific student populations, or they're focused on a legislative initiative, or they're focused on something that our legislators have felt requires attention. So it might be reading one year, it might be math the next, it might be some other area. And these can be annually reoccurring grants if they're set up that way, or they can be 1 year at a time. It all depends on how they're written into the School Aid Act. For most districts, the at-risk grant, or also known as 31A, they're the same pot of money, same grant actually, is the most popular and most well-known of the categorical grants. Next slide, please. So if you are new to school finance, this is probably the very first and the most important formula for you to know, and that is how we calculate foundation allowance. And foundation allowance is simply the number of pupils multiplied by the foundation allowance amount. Now, what is the foundation allowance amount? That is an amount determined annually by the state legislature in concurrence with the governor. It's written into the School Aid Act, and it's a dollar amount. Right now, it's a little over $8,000 a year at the base amount. And I think the most important part to understand is that this is controlled by the state legislature. Can we back up one there, please, Jen? Thank you. In addition, something that you need to be aware of is that there is a requirement in order to receive your full state funding that you pass 18 mills on non-homestead property taxes. Each district must pass this. If you don't pass this, you will not be able to get your full foundation allowance. And the reason that was put in at the time that this funding mechanism was initiated in 1994 is this is an indication of local control. That's probably the biggest part of it. And then the last item that you should be aware of is pupil count. And pupil count is a weighted average that takes into account your prior school year spring count and your current year's fall count. And they use a weighted average to come up with your number of pupils.
Hey, Ken, there is a question in the box about how we count the number of students and how that may impact them for the upcoming year. I just want to, Jen and I can talk about that when we get to it, but just so you're aware that there is a question, we'll get to that as we make our way through the presentation.
Okay, yep. So we'll answer that here shortly. Next slide, please. The next pot of money that really we end up spending a lot of time on at the district level is in the area of federal funds. Now, interestingly enough, federal revenue across the state of Michigan only makes up 6% of school district budgets, but it consumes a disproportionate amount of your staff's time due to the rules and the regulations and the record keeping requirements of these federal funds. That's just the nature of federal grants. And some folks, and I've heard some folks say, well, if there's so much of a pain, maybe we should not participate. And that is how you would get out from underneath those. The problem is one of the largest federal programs is your free and reduced lunch program, and you're pretty much required to handle that. So if you're going to have to deal with the federal rules on the free and reduced lunch, it behooves most districts to also participate then in some of the other large programs, the biggest one being the Title I program. And the Title I funds, the federal program, is targeted at economically disadvantaged students, and they're very similar to the state's at-risk or 31A categorical funding. And so you can see here, we have a large state grant and we have a large federal grant that is targets towards our neediest students. The federal funds also provide, or federal grants also provide, a significant amount of money for students with disabilities. That comes through the IDEA, or Individuals with Disabilities Act. Once you get beyond those two big chunks of federal funds, there are a multitude of federal grants out there, but they tend to be very specific, and not all districts qualify for every grant. So whatever the characteristics of your district are going to drive a lot of the grants that you qualify for. In some areas of the state of Michigan, for instance, English language learner students or English as a second language students, there are a lot of them, and those programs are very large. And in other parts of the state, that is just not a very big issue, and those grants are very small or non-existent. Teacher development, many other grants out there that are very focused.
Hey, I have a question. There's a question about, are there creative things that schools can do to increase their revenue outside of government funds, like private?
Lots of creative ideas, but I will say that those are outside the scope of this presentation because we're limited on time. But if you were to attend CBA, some of the 3 or 4 CBA courses that we offer, especially the intermediate and advanced finance, we do talk about a lot of those creative ideas.
All right, and then we got a couple more questions maybe before we move on. Just should local districts be concerned about the number of taxing authorities in their districts which capture property tax revenues?
Yes, if you have authorities out there that are called TIFs or brownfields, or several other different types, that they operate by giving incentives, by relieving companies from having to pay property taxes, or if they pay property taxes, they're captured to fund special programs. Certainly, if they're capturing your school operating revenue, that's a concern. If they're capturing your debt millage, that may not be as much of a concern due to the way that those are calculated. If it's capturing your sinking fund millages or your enhancement fund millages, yeah, certainly they're impacting your ability to operate those programs.
And then there was thank you for that. And then there was one more question. How often does the non-homestead tax go before the voters?
How often the non-homestead 18 mills goes in front of the voters is a district by district choice. Because that millage is subject to something called the Headley Amendment, which can actually erode away those 18 mills under certain circumstances. Districts that have that erosion effect impact them may take that 18 mills to the voters more often in order to offset that erosion. Districts that do not see the Headley Amendment impact its 18 mills, those districts tend to vote for long periods of time. I believe you can actually vote that up. It's 18 mills up to 20 years, I think, is the limitation. So it can go a long way. But my experience has been most districts are somewhere between 5 and 10 years. Yeah, between 5 and 10 years would be pretty common.
Thank you. I think that's all the questions we had of you at this point.
Please. So if we take a look here at this pie chart, that is the typical or the average distribution of revenue coming into school districts in the state of Michigan, you can see that the top three lines, the foundation grant, the 18 mills of non-homestead property taxes, and the state categorical funding, they make up 88.9% of your overall funding. And frankly, those three lines are essentially controlled by the state of Michigan. So these, there is a significant amount of state control over your revenue. Federal grants only make up 4.5%, and your local miscellaneous income and your intermediate school district support makes up the remaining 6.6%. And the key to take away from this here is that it behooves you to pay attention to what the state is doing, because they by far control our funding to a huge extent. Next slide, please. This next pie chart shows how the average school district in 1819 spends its dollars. And I used 1819 because that is the most recent report out of the state. The report is called Bulletin 1014. You might want to jot that down. Bulletin 1014 is a great source of very high level financial information. MISchoolData.org pulls from that information, provides the same stuff. But this is the most recent comparative information of statewide expenditure data that we have. Notice here that schools are definitely a people business, and as a result, the vast majority of our costs are people costs. 79.4% of all of our school expenses are made up of salaries and benefits. And it's just a reflection of the type of business that we do. Purchase services, which are, those are professional services, such as if we, plumbers and consultants, sometimes transportation, if we're purchasing it from a third party, those make up that 12.5%. Notice that school supplies, our pencils and our paper and our crayons and our edible paste, it's only 5%. There's not a whole lot of dollars there. Capital outlay makes up 3.1, and all others make up 2%. Next slide, please. So, as a Board of Education and as district administrators, we have to recognize that if personnel costs make up 79% of our overall district costs, then that tells us that the key to controlling our budget is to control personnel costs. And to kind of give you an idea of what we're talking, and this is the total cost of one teacher. And I've given you some ideas of what a new teacher costs, the state average, and the top end. And so a new teacher in the state of Michigan in 1819 was around $40,000. You could be more or less depending on the collective bargaining agreement that's in effect at your district, but it's around $40,000. The statewide salary in that same year was 62. So that's probably a teacher that's been around for, somewhere between 8 and 10 years. And then the top end teachers are about 95,000. And those are teachers who are working with, doctoral degrees and have been in the district, 25 or more years. So that's kind of your range. Our retirement system is going to tack on about 26% of the salary amount as additional cost. FICA, which is your Medicaid and Social Security, taps on another 7.65%. And then I put in here the state's capped amount for full family health insurance. Now, I'm not saying that every teacher is going to get full family health insurance. They could be a single, in which case that $19,211 amount is going to be something somewhat smaller. But for this discussion, I would just kind of compare apples to apples. And so understand that a new teacher is going to cost us somewhere around $72,000. Our average teacher is 102, and our top end, most experienced, most talented, arguably most talented teachers are just shy of $150,000. It's important to understand that if we keep our arms around these personnel costs, we'll have our arms around our budget. Next slide, please. Okay, Tracy, I'll get your next question here in a minute. So capital expenses, what are capital expenses? Those are really the cost for maintaining the facilities. Our most common tend to be roofs, replacing parking lots and pavement, and replacing our heating and ventilation systems. And there are your general fund or your operating funds may pay for these, but there are other ways of paying for these, such as sinking funds and debt service funds, those alternatives. And you will hear about those alternatives from your administrative team as they process through that. And then we have reoccurring equipment costs that you often see. Band instruments is a big one, especially if you have a large marching band. My last district was Petoskey Schools, and we put a lot of money into band equipment, but that's because that was one of the things that my district was well known for. Computer labs and weight room, those are all great things. So Tracy had a question here about retirement cost for now is zero now, isn't it? And the answer is no, it is not zero. It's about 26% is what the state, is what we are paying as a district into the state. Even for new teachers, there is still, we're paying in right around 21% for a teacher on the new retirement system. When you get done with the matching amounts that we're required to provide, and you get done paying the catch-up amounts into the unfunded liability amount, we're still in there at around 21% for new teachers. So now in the year 2038, under the current plan, that 21 to 26% will drop very significantly. And Jen, did you include the MIPSers, any of the MIPSers stuff in there?
We did not, because it is so detailed, but I can talk about it if you want, or if you want to cover it.
No, I mean, I think the Cliff Notes version is that there is a plan in place that keeps retirement costs capped while funding the liability that has built up over the last several decades. And under the current plan in the year 2038, we'll have caught up with that unfunded liability, and our costs are projected to drop very significantly, probably into the single digits. So, but that's a few years out. Next slide, please. And then, there is so much more. So 79% of our costs are in people, and all these items that you see in front of you make up the rest of those costs. Everything from teaching supplies to textbooks to energy costs, everything, sporting events, sporting facilities, fine arts, transportation. This makes up most of the 11% that's remaining. Next slide, please. You can skip right through those. Sorry about that. The last thing I want to touch base is fund balance, because you're going to hear about it a lot. So what is fund balance? Fund balance is essentially the running total of every year's net income plus or minus the net loss since your district was born. So in the case of Petoskey Schools, it was born in 1879, I believe. And so the fund balance this year is the sum total of all net income and net losses for every year since then. Some districts and some folks out there view fund balance as an informal scorecard. They see years where we add a little bit to fund balance as a win and decreases as losses. And that's not necessarily a good way or a bad way to look at it. Just be aware that fund balance, as a board, you may choose to build up fund balance for a purpose and then spend it down for that purpose. The important part is if it's going up or going down, that we know why and it's going the way that we want it. I think those are the important parts of it. Next slide, please. So why do you need this fund balance? It does all these things. Probably the most important one there is item number 3, which is you're required to have a positive fund balance. That you need to have, at least $1 in the bank if you go below, or if you're projected to go below 0 in your fund balance. Then you get the opportunity to spend a lot of time talking with Michigan Department of Education and Department of Treasury, and you get to put something together called a deficit reduction plan, and they're just not a whole lot of fun. I do not recommend dropping your fund balance below zero. It reduces your need for borrowing. State aid notes reduces the size of the state aid notes. It gives you something when the unexpected happens. If a windstorm comes through and puts holes in your roof, you got to fix them somehow. Where's that money going to come from? That's where fund balance comes in. Next slide, please. So kind of a busy slide here, but this is a question I get quite often, which is how much fund balance is enough? And the answer is there is no single answer, okay? So what I've given you here is, 5 or 6 bullet points and the value and an example of what the value range would be. In this particular, I think I based this example off of Greenville Public Schools. They have annual expenditures of about $37.5 million. And you can see the range that their fund balance would be based on each of these recommendations. So your auditors are going to tell you 10 to 18% of expenses. Credit rating agencies in the state are suggesting at least 5%. And depending on what your cash flow looks like, you may choose to use that. That's a technique I used in Petoskey that seemed to work okay. It really is a board and management decision on what are you comfortable with. So some districts say as much as we can, as high as we can make it, and others are much more comfortable being closer to zero. So, but these are some rules of thumb for you to take back and chew on a little bit.
Hey, Kent, is there state oversight if the balance dips below 5%?
No, but there is a requirement for professional training for the Board of Education that allows it to drop below 5%. Now, what that training looks like, that's still kind of iffy, but there is something on the books that says the district's Board of Education is supposed to receive school finance training if their fund balance falls below 5%. So that's a very recent rule. But it's only at the point that your fund balance is projected or budgeted to fall below zero that you have to let the state know that you're going into deficit, and it triggers the deficit laws.
Actually, Kent, to add to that, we passed early warning laws not too long ago that now if you fall below 5%, Treasury gives you a call to say, what's going on? Can you show me your budget? What are you doing? So you don't hit the deficit elimination plans, but you're going to get a phone call from Treasury wondering why you're below 5%.
Thank you. Next slide. I think that was my last one.
Hey, Kent, before we switch over to the next portion, there was a question in the chat. How much should the academic improvement plan play into developing your budget? Sort of a general question. How much impact should that have?
Most districts would take an academic improvement plan and bake it into their vision and goals. And if you do that, then your budget should reflect that. Now there are, and I have worked in a district where they developed a academic plan that we actually didn't do anything with because we didn't put the money in to support it. That's an example of what not to do. If you have an academic improvement plan, if you're serious about it, your budget needs to reflect it. And that usually means you're going to hire some consultants, you're going to bring maybe some additional staff on. But to do that, other parts of your budget, obviously are going to feel that impact. But yeah, if you've got a plan, if you're serious about your plan, your budget needs to reflect it.
And then one more thing back to the fund balance. There was a question, can you have too much in your fund balance?
Only if, yes, you can, but how you know if you had too much is if you have constituents in your board meeting saying you've built up too much fund balance, you need to, we're being taxed too much. That's usually what you hear. It also will make bargaining, collective bargaining, very interesting for you. I mean, if you have a very large fund balance, you're going to find that collective bargaining is there's going to be an interest in sharing that fund balance with your employees. So, but legally, can you have too much? No, legally, there's no cap that I'm aware of.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, well, we will move into the state side of this, and some of the questions that we saw come up in the chat we can cover here. And one of the first ones that I want to talk about is matching budget timelines, state and local. That was a question that came up earlier. It's a question we get a lot, and there has been talk about it, but it is expensive, and it would require the state to only collect 9 months worth of revenue rather than 12 to run a fiscal year. And so it is billions of dollars to move that date for the state to move back to June to match the locals. Once upon a time, that was true, that they were the same. And it was a budgeting gimmick when they moved it to get 15 months worth of revenue in a year as they moved the fiscal year to October. So there's been talk about it, but then people get sticker shock with moving it back to June and losing that 3 month of revenue and trying to run the state on 9 months instead of 12. So it comes up every once in a while. Unfortunately, with term limits, we find there are some legislators that don't understand that the school budget ends June 30th and not September 30th like the state. So as you're talking to your new legislators, make sure they're aware of that, make sure they understand that that is part of the push to get our budgets done by July. So the other big question I always get is, what about the lottery money? And so that's why we always include this slide. If you look at this, this is all of the different revenue sources that go into the school aid fund that then flow back out through the foundation allowance. And you'll notice the black pie shape there, 7% of the entire school aid pie is lottery money. It is true that we get 100% of the profits from the lottery do flow to the schools. It's just that it is only $1 billion, only $1 billion. But in a budget of this size, that is only 7%. It would run our schools for about a week. So when you get those questions, and I promise you're going to get them, why are we paying taxes? We have the lottery. It's because the lottery is not nearly a big enough revenue source to fund our schools, but we do get 100% of the profits from the lottery. The biggest pot on there is sales tax. Sales and use tax combined are almost 50% of our revenue. And so we are always keeping an eye on those sales tax projections. And when we're talking about taking things, exempting them from the sales tax. And then the income tax is about 21%. We get that money before credits. So any income tax credit does not affect the funds that are coming into the school aid fund. But as we change the rate, we now have a formula that will always make sure we receive the same amount of money, no matter whether the rate goes up or down. This was put in when they put a trigger in to lower the rate years ago to hold the school aid fund harmless from that rate going down. So we'll continue to get that 21% of the budget. And then the state education tax is on all the property across the state. The use tax goes with the sales tax. And then those other three at the bottom, the real estate transfer tax, that's anybody buying and selling. We get a small portion of the tobacco tax, and then other revenues that flow in there. But the biggest things we're always watching are the sales and the income tax. And outgoing, we have seen since 2010, money flowing out. This pie used to be all blue, and it's not anymore. We now see money flow out to the community colleges and higher education. And while combined last year, it was 5% of the budget. It is close to $1 billion. At one point, we were at $1 billion flowing out of the school aid fund into community colleges and higher education. In 2010, when Governor Granholm first did this, it was $150 million for a loan to the community college budget that they would pay back to the school aid fund. As you know, or can see, that didn't happen. We were not refunded. And under Governor Snyder's tenure, we saw those numbers go up incredibly high. The community college budget is now 100% funded with school aid dollars, and that higher ed budget number creeps up and down. And the higher ed budget is one that we're always worried about. because the higher ed budget itself is about 1.2 billion. So there's a lot of money they could keep shifting into school aid, which is why one of MASB's priorities is to continually get the higher ed money out of our budget. So this chart just sort of shows the history of the per pupil fluctuations. You see the dark color is at the state maximum, which is called the target foundation. And the lighter color is that minimum number, which is the lowest amount that a district can receive from the state per pupil. So this shows the changes in those. We tend to use a 2x formula. It's not always there, but over the last few years we have used it. So you'll see in fiscal year 20, there was 120 to 240 proposed. We didn't end up getting there when COVID hit, but that allowed for the higher funded districts, the target formula, to get the 120, while the lower districts got 240 per pupil to try to close that gap. And the governor's budget is proposing another 2x formula to close that gap even further. So we'll be down to about $360 between the target and the minimum foundations. And you'll notice this big drop in fiscal year 12 of that 470. That was when the ERA funds, the federal funds that were given to us when we were trying to come out of the recession, that's when those funds ended. And so there were no federal funds to prop up the budget anymore. And we saw that huge decline in per pupil. So the goal of Proposal A, when we changed from funding schools fully on local property taxes to this foundation allowance, was to close the gap between districts. A mill in Iron Mountain does not raise the same as a mill in Ann Arbor. And you could see that as people were trying to adjust to get the money that they needed to run their schools. So Proposal A set this minimum foundation allowance to make sure that everybody was getting at least that amount. And then the goal through the years has been to close that gap so that we get everybody to the target foundation.
Hey, Jen.
Most districts are at that minimum level. Sorry, go ahead, Jeff.
Sorry, there was some question about what is Proposal A. So I want to make sure that people are not confused as we're talking about that right now.
So Proposal A was passed in 1994, went into effect in 1994. And it changed how we funded schools. It was a massive overhaul. And it went before the voters. It raised our sales tax to 6%, but ended the funding, the pure funding of our schools based on the local property taxes. That additional 2% that was added to our sales tax, 100% of it goes to schools. That's why our pot of money, our revenue source from sales tax is so large. It was designed that way under Proposal A. So you hear about Prop A and Proposal A a lot as you hear about funding for schools and equity in schools. There's a lot of push to redo this formula to try to get the equity there better. Proposal A is designed to pay you for butts and seats. You get, $8,500 per kid that shows up on count day. But as we have grown through the years, we've noticed and studies have shown the difference between how we educate our kids. And so you'll hear a lot of people talk about those equity things. And that's why we have categoricals that we'll talk about as well, that try to reflect the idea that an at-risk child, a special education child, an ELL child, an English language learner, they cost more to educate than your average child. And so Proposal A is just flat across the board. And then we have various things in our budget that try to make up those differences. So the other question we get asked a lot is, what are the odds of changing Proposal A? And you have to understand that Proposal A took years to come to fruition. And then this was a Christmas Eve vote in '93 to put it before the voters. So the idea of changing Proposal A, while a lot of people are interested in it, it is a huge lift. And it would take someone, a legislator who is dedicated to doing that, and you just don't see someone willing to give their short tenure under term limits completely to rewriting Proposal A. So I think we'll see little tweaks around the edges. I think eventually we'll get there, but I think it's going to take a long time. So the foundation allowance today is $81.11 for your minimum foundation and the $85.29 for the target foundation. And then the districts are spread in between, but the majority of our districts are at that minimum foundation. There are a small number of districts that are considered hold harmless districts. And these were ones who had high foundation allowances that had been raised through their property taxes when Proposal A was passed. And so there's probably less than 50 across the state that were allowed to pass an additional millage if their voters approved it after Proposal A. They had one shot. And if they did that, then they could receive that money from their foundational, or their foundation allowance could be set at the amount that they could raise locally. So you'll hear about hold harmless districts, and they are ones that are receiving over the target foundation due to the taxes that they collect at the local level. The 2X formula, as I explained, it means that the minimum foundation people, they get twice as much as the target foundation. This year's budget proposal is calling for an 82,164 increase in the per pupil allowance. We don't know if that will stick, but that is the governor's proposal right now. And I will turn it back to talk about the categoricals.
Sure. So, on top of the foundation allowance, the state does spend money on sort of what they call categoricals. And these are specific categories of spending. Probably the biggest ones you'll hear about are special education, at risk. There's something for preschool students called the Great Start Readiness Program. So all of this funding is above and beyond what you would receive in your foundation allowance. And it'll differ from district to district based on the number of special ed kids you might have, based on the number of at-risk kids you might have, based on the number of enrollees you might have in your Great Start Readiness Program. There are other categoricals. There's actually several of them. We have seen, we've tried to kind of shrink the number of categoricals in the past and roll it all into the foundation allowance so that every district can receive more of an increase. But there still are these important areas. And like Jen was saying, one of the reasons you do this is because it's a recognition that some students cost more to educate than other students. And so we'd like to say that every kid, costs equally, but we know that there are some kids who just have specific needs and it just costs a lot more to educate them. So next slide. So I just want to go over real briefly just sort of how this budget process actually works in Lansing. So for the most part, it will start off in January. So the House and Senate fiscal agencies and the Michigan treasurer will get together and they will try to figure out how much money the state has to spend in the next upcoming budget for both the general fund and for the school aid fund. And so they will get together, they will agree to an estimate. It's based on sales tax revenue coming in, income tax revenue, economic conditions, et cetera. Now, after that happens, then the governor will propose her budget in February. So she or the budget director will come in before the House and Senate and lay out their proposals. It is available online. You can take a look at her proposals. And then after that is where we're at right now in the process. And that's where the House Appropriations Subcommittee and the Senate subcommittees are holding hearings to discuss the governor's proposal. They're taking testimony from other interested groups who would like money in the budget. So right now they're kind of doing the sort of the nitty gritty, trying to put together their proposals. Later on, generally it used to be before spring break, but I would say in the past several years, it's been after spring break. The House and Senate will each pass their version of the school aid budget. And then, generally there are significant differences. And so those will have to be ironed out. Next slide, please. So what will happen in May is that we'll have another estimating forecasting conference. And again, this is just to make sure that the numbers they were using in January are still applicable. Last year, because of COVID, you saw just this huge plummet in predicted revenue. And so it kind of threw everything into a mess. We weren't really sure what we were going to do. But that's why you have the May conference, because things can be unpredictable. There are things you might not be planning for. But in a normal year, you would take whatever the revenue is in May, and then the House and Senate will send their budgets to what they call conference committees. These are committees made up of 3 senators and 3 representatives, and they will get together and hammer out their differences between the budgets. They will then send those back to the House and the Senate for full approval, and then hopefully they get voted out by early summer. In July, or in 2019, there was a law that was signed that would require the budget to be sent to the governor by July 1st. Now, this is exactly the discussion we had earlier, trying to link the school fiscal year with the state fiscal year. In 2019, it was especially bad. The state, because of some budget impasses, they couldn't figure out how to pass the budget until late September. And so it kept a lot of districts in limbo, not knowing how much they were going to receive. And so there was a law that was passed that says, no, it should be sent to the governor now by July 1st. So the first year this would have gone into effect was last year. And of course, they waived that law last year. And so hopefully this year, they will actually complete the budget process and submit it to the governor by July 1st. Once it goes to the governor, she can veto it, she can sign it. But she also has this sort of unique authority, and that's called the line item veto. So she can take specific programs like those categoricals we talked about, like some like reporting language, et cetera. She can strike that out of the budget if she wants to. It's a pretty powerful tool that she has to use, and she actually just did that in the supplemental that was signed yesterday. She struck out some language. Next slide, please. So speaking of supplementals, so supplemental budgets can occur anytime during the fiscal year. And what these are is they make adjustments based on changes to revenue. So for instance, last year when we thought there was going to be a lot less revenue, there was supplemental budgets that were presented to reflect those changes. This year, there is a huge influx of federal revenue from the COVID relief packages. So the second round of federal dollars is actually making its way through the state. And the House and Senate passed the supplemental budget just last week, and the governor signed a portion of that budget yesterday. So this is federal money that will go to the districts to help provide resources to combat COVID. So it could help for technology, it could help for personal protective equipment, it could help provide money funding for services to help kids who have experienced learning loss, etc. So there was a question that I saw in the chat box a little bit ago about the COVID relief money. So this money coming right now was money that was appropriated in December in the second round of COVID relief. So the districts all got their first round last year out of what they call the CARES Fund. This round is, like I say, a portion of that is signed into law that will be going out to the districts. And it goes out through using a formula that kind of gives more funding to schools that have more at-risk kids, essentially. So there is another COVID relief fund that is going to pass probably today in Washington. That money then will go to Michigan and it will go through the budget process, but that is not coming quite yet, but we expect it to come in the very near future. All right, next slide.
One of the other questions about the supplemental was, when did you have to spend it by with the COVID money? And the federal budget on this part 2 says by September of 2022. So it is for both this school year and the next.
Jen, do you want to take this one or am I taking this slide?
Sure, I can up here. So we've mentioned as we go through to some of these threats to the higher aid, to the school aid fund, including diverting funding to higher education and community colleges. As we showed in that slide, right now we are at about 700 million or $800 million that are going out the door. It at one point was as high as $1 billion. So we have seen some walk back on this, but the threat is always there that as the general fund gets stressed, one of the places they can find space is if they move some of the higher education funding out of the general fund and put it into the school aid fund. And so we have always had this priority since 2010 that we would like the Constitution to be clear that the school aid fund is for pre-K to 12 and not intended for our state university system. And then transferring programs from the general fund to the school aid fund, the higher education and community colleges are the biggest ones, but there's lots of little things that keep happening. School bus inspections used to happen under the state police budget. They're talking today about putting a program called Filter First into the school aid fund instead of the environmental fund to require for filters on all of the drinking fountains in schools. And so there's lots of these little things that keep moving into the school aid budget that is another on top of the 800 million that's going to higher ed and community colleges. It's another about $200 million when you add it all up. And as they find those little tweaks that they can do, the school aid fund has to be used for school purposes. And so if they find a way that they can justify it as an educational purpose, they've been moving it into our fund through the years. And then finally, the changes in state tax policy. This gets ignored pretty often because we don't think about it. But every time we cut property taxes somewhere, exempt something from personal property taxes, exempt things from sales and use tax, that hits the revenue stream to our school aid fund. And we started tracking this. So from 2013 to 2018, you see sort of a breakdown here of how many public acts were passed that made cuts or revenue increases. And every once in a while, we got a revenue increase. But what this boils down to is the information on this slide. Over those 6 years, 363 million at a minimum has been diverted from the school aid fund. And then there are the 43 bills that the cost is unknown. The minimum increase we've seen has only been 87 million. And when you put those together, you end up with $187 per pupil that we have lost over the last 6 years due to tax policy changes. And it's all little things, one by one by one by one. $1 million here, 2 million there, 300,000. We would testify on these bills and be told, oh, it's only $1 million, but it's only $1 million today. And then as we add them up, we've reached these numbers. We have made some inroads in this through the years that people are paying attention to it now. And we have gotten some legislators that pull back from these issues because they know it's going to hurt our schools and communities. The most recent bill moving to the system right now is Senate Bill 46, and this would exempt all broadband equipment, all new broadband equipment from the personal property tax. As originally written, it would have exempted property that you use to replace old property. So anytime you replace an old equipment, it would be exempt from taxes that you're paying on that old equipment. And that would be a direct hit to the school districts that live in that area where the business is at. So that language was removed. So there is no retroactive hit to the school aid fund or to our local schools. And we believe a lot of that is because of this push that we have been able to make through the years. Oops, wrong. Other revenue factors are federal grants, the things that come in through Title I, through IDEA to pay for special education. Your local ISD may have millages, enhancement millages flow down to the constituent districts. Those CTE, voc ed, special ed millages, those stay with the ISD to run those programs. And then millages that you may be running yourselves for bonds or sinking funds or things like that for capital improvements. So before I get to questions, there's a couple we didn't answer that I want to circle back to. One was on the pupil count. And we saw in 2019, you had, or for the 1920 school year, with the pandemic, they changed the 2021 school year, they changed the pupil count. And what they created was a super blend that was designed to help districts that were losing kids, or the count was off because in October, Some districts were hybrid, some were in person, many were remote, and it was hard to find some of those kids and count them. And so it created this super blend that weighted most of your per pupil amount on the 1920 year and only a small portion on the 2021 count. As we go into the 21-22 school year, we're going back to the original count, which is 90% of your October count of 2021 and 10% of your February count from 2021 will make up your pupil number that you will get your foundation allowance on. There's also in the governor's budget a piece for declining enrollment districts, so that if your pupil count for this school year is lower than your pupil count was last school year with the super blend, you would receive an additional amount of money per pupil lost. And this was the governor's way of trying to take us back to the pupil count we're used to, but acknowledge that pupils have moved around. And we still have pupils that we're trying to track down, that we're trying to engage, and that we're trying to get in the seats so that we can count them properly. So we don't know if that will stick as we go through the legislative process, but it is something that we have been pushing for pretty heavy on that. The historical gross pupil funding growth against inflationary considerations is something we bring up a lot. It is not kept pace with inflation at all. This year's proposal, the minimum foundation allowance will keep with inflation, but no one above that will get the rate of inflation. And this has been an ongoing issue. And we know that even though you may get a small bump this year, the $84 if you're a target foundation allowance district, that's not keeping with the rate of inflation. And therefore, it's actually not an increase for you as your costs go up. And we have these arguments and this push-pull with the legislature quite often, where they will point to that chart that shows how many years they've increased the per pupil. And we point to a chart saying this is where we should be if we would have kept pace with inflation. So this is a push-pull argument that happens all the time. It's hard to convince some people that an increase doesn't necessarily mean an actual increase. They see positive dollars, and that means positive money for you.
Jen, there was a question about the governor's proposal to give free community college for essential workers. Does that come out of state or federal funds?
I believe part of that is coming out of the GEAR money, which is the governor's education emergency relief fund. I would have to check and see where it's coming from now, but I believe that's where it started. But if it becomes a community college cost, it would fall under the school aid fund eventually if the GEAR money isn't there to cover it.
And I don't know that I see any other questions that we haven't answered or addressed.
All right, well, if you have any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I know we are right at 1 o'clock. We have a few more minutes if anybody has the questions. We also have all of our contact information there on the screen, and we'll send these slides out. So if you have further questions that you think of later, or as you look back through the slides, please feel free to contact us. Most of all, thanks for joining us today. We really hope that it was useful and beneficial for you. It is an overview. School finance is a pretty hefty issue. As Kent mentioned briefly, we didn't even get into the MIPSers and the retirement issues. That could be a whole other presentation. So always feel free to reach out if you have questions. And some of those really detailed ones, your district business officer may be the best one to answer for you.